Hi there, this video is a continuation of my previous Napalm with Ansible video. So in this one, I'm going to take a look at the Napalm auto rollback feature. And I'm also going to have a look at rerunning a Napalm merge, but just to understand what commands exactly it runs on the router when it runs. And I'm going to do that by using an EEM script that I learned from Ivan Popelniak's ipspace.net website that will log all commands run on the router to the local buffer and to the console. And firstly, just looking at the lab is the same as the previous video. The only difference is in this video, in my playbook, I've adjusted the host's variable to only run the playbook on the iOS-3 device. So if we log in there, and if we just have a look at the show run pipe section event, you'll see that I've created this EEM script that is going to match on any command that runs on the device and log it with the message cmd underscore syslog. So you can see when I ran this show run, I get this message in the buffer and on the console that the show running config command has run. So when we do an APAM merge, we will see all of the commands that Ansible runs when it logs into to merge the config that we're trying to merge on this particular router. The other thing I just wanted to show was when Napalm runs, it creates a number of files. So if you're trying to merge some config, it will scp that config from the Ansible host onto your devices and store it in a file called merge underscore config.txt. And we have a look at that. We can see from the previous video run that I'm enable OSPF on loopback 0 and gigabit Ethernet 1. But before it actually merges the config, it also takes a capture of the existing running config and it stores that in a file called rollback config. So if we have a look at rollback underscore config.txt, you can see that's the config before we applied OSPF. So if we have a look at our interfaces, we don't have OSPF configured on loopback 0 or gig 1, and we don't have the OSPF process configured. So with those two files, we could do a config replace and go back to the original state. So if we just config replace and reinstall the rollback config onto the device, and we say, and you can see that because of our EEM script, it tells us what commands it ran. So you can see on interface gig 1, it's disable the OSPF process and the OSPF network command, and the same on loopback 0. And if we do show IP OSPF neighbor now, we can see we have no neighbors. And if we look at one of the interfaces, OSPF is no longer configured. So now we're back to the state that this device was in before we done the Napalm merge. So if we now go back to the Ansible host and rerun our Ansible script, just log into it just to show what it's going to do. So it's basically creating the config with a Jinja template in this task here, and then it uses the Napalm merge to push the generated config onto the device, and it sets the replace underscore config parameter to false, which means it's going to be a merge. So let's just run that. So the config's already generated, so we haven't made a change with the Jinja task. And now we napalm merge, and we should see some output appear, some log messages appear on the iOS 3 device. So yeah, so now we can see exactly what it done. So the first thing we can see, terminal length 0 is set, which is quite typical of Ansible when it connects into a device. The next key task is it verifies the merge underscore config.text after the SCP transfer to make sure it wasn't corrupted on file transfer. Then it configures the file prompt quiet command. So that's this command means that the script won't get prompted. Like if you run a command and it asks you a question to confirm, you won't get that prompt, which would actually break the script. And then it takes a backup of the current running config and stores it as rollback underscore config.txt. And then it copies the merge config to running config. So that's the actual merge there. And we can see the output of the merge is that on loopback 0, we configure our necessary OSPF commands, and the same on gigabit Ethernet 1. And then once that's configured, we can see straight away afterwards that we have a neighbor going into the fully converged state on gigabit Ethernet 1 as expected, and it saves the config with the right mem and reverts the file prompt quiet command and exits. So we can now see, if we do a show IP OSPF neighbor command, that we have our adjacency as expected. So what would happen if we had made a mistake in our Jinja file? If we have a mistake, say halfway down in our Jinja file, we could have undesirable behavior where half the config is applied, then it hits the error, and the rest of the config is not applied. Fortunately, Napalm can detect that. If it gets a command that it can't apply for whatever reason, you have a typo or whatever is wrong with that command, it will use that rollback underscore config.txt file that it created, the backup of the running config, and it'll roll back the config for you. So what I've done just to demonstrate this is I've created a simple Jinja file, and I've got two logging commands in here. The first one is a legitimate command, and the second one has a deliberate error where I've added a fifth octet. So that's obviously going to fail when you try to configure that on a Cisco device. So if we just go into our Napalm merge YAML file and just change the config parameter to syslog.j2, and we just change this to syslog as well. Right. And now let's run that, and we'll see what happens. So the Jinja runs again. It's not applicable this time, and we're going to do our Napalm merge again with the syslog, and we would expect that this would fail. And when you're using iOS config command or iOS command, you would be familiar with this type of message where the invalid input detected that you would get if you're logged into the router is returned, and the script has failed and it's logged as a failure. So if we go back to the router and we review what it actually done. So again, term length 0 verifies the merge config, and then after the file prompt quiet, we can see that it backs up the config to rollback underscore config.txt, and it it's missed the message on the console, so it will be in the buffer. If we look at it from here, we can see, so we're starting from here. So there's the login. It verifies the merge config. File prompt quiet. Backs up the config to rollback underscore config as before. Copies the merge config to the running config. So that's our merge here. And straight after the merge, you can see that we have logging to host 10.1.1.1. So it's taken that command. And then we can see that it does a config replace, and it rolls back the config because of the fact that the second logging command didn't work. So we can see in here it's doing an actual config replace. That's our rollback with the force option. And you can see the command there, no logging host 10.1.1.1. So it actually removes the logging host that it had successfully configured. So if we do a show run and include for logging, we can see that neither command is left after it's made a decision to roll back. So it rollbacks to that state that it found it in. So this is really important, this auto rollback feature, because it gives us confidence that if we're using Napalm to configure our network, that Napalm is clever enough to know that if it hits an issue, it will roll back the config. So that's a real added benefit of Napalm. You can't call the rollback directly with Napalm. With Ansible, with Napalm when you're using with Ansible. But if you were using Napalm directly with Python, you can actually call the rollback option directly. So you could have a particular condition. If that condition is met or not met, that you roll back the config, which is really good when you're doing it through Python. But that option isn't available in Ansible. So the only time you will see the rollback is this auto rollback feature that is built into Ansible. So that concludes that video. I hope that was helpful and gives some confidence in using Napalm, in that if it does hit any issues, if there's a typo in your Ginger file, that Napalm will roll back the config on your router. Thank you for watching.